The bustling airport was alive with energy. Travelers rushing through terminals, luggage wheels clattering against polished floors, and the distant hum of announcements over the intercom. Among the sea of passengers, 16-year-old Simone Harris walked confidently, her first-class boarding pass in hand. This wasn't just a flight. It was the beginning of a celebration. Simone had recently won a prestigious science scholarship and was flying home after being honored at an award ceremony. Dressed in a stylish but understated outfit, a white blouse paired with tailored black slacks, she looked every bit the poised and accomplished young woman she was. But she wasn't expecting this flight to become a test of everything her father had taught her about composure, self-worth, and standing up for herself. Prejudice can strike when you least expect it. As we delve into this story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And click on the subscribe button if you believe everyone should be treated fairly without prejudice, no matter who they are. Simone stepped into the first-class cabin, taking in the soft leather seats and the quiet luxury that surrounded her. The calming ambiance was a welcome contrast to the hectic airport. She found her seat, tucked her bag in the overhead compartment, and settled in. A small smile crossed her face as she glanced at her phone. A message from her father popped up. "Safe travels, my girl. Let me know when you land. Proud of you." Simone's father, Charles Harris, wasn't just proud. He was the CEO of the airline she was flying on. He had built his airline from the ground up, known for its impeccable service and dedication to fairness. But he never believed in flaunting his status. Simone had learned from him to stay grounded and let her actions speak louder than words. As the boarding process continued, Simone felt the warm buzz of anticipation. She hadn't been home in months and missed her father more than she realized. This flight was supposed to be the perfect bridge between her recent achievement and the warmth of home waiting on the other side. But all that changed in an instant. A stern voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, young lady." Simone looked up to find Patricia Davis, a senior flight attendant with sharp features and an unmistakably condescending tone, standing in front of her row. Patricia's eyes flickered over Simone's outfit, her curly hair neatly pulled back, and then settled on her face with a subtle air of suspicion. "First class is for paying passengers," Patricia said with a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Economy is just down the aisle." Simone blinked in confusion. "I am a first-class passenger," she said, holding up her boarding pass. "This is my seat." Patricia didn't even glance at the boarding pass. "There must be some mistake. Please head to the economy so we can keep things moving." Simone's heart clenched. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers turning toward her, some curious, others judgmental. It wasn't just the words Patricia used, it was the dismissive way she said them, the way she had decided without a second thought that Simone didn't belong there. "I'm sorry, but this is my seat," Simone repeated, her voice calm but firm. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Patricia raised an eyebrow, her patience wearing thin. "I don't want to cause a scene," she said, lowering her voice just enough to sound threatening. "Just head back to economy before I have to call security." The sting of humiliation burned in Simone's chest, but she refused to let it show. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Stay calm. Even when others try to take your dignity, never let them see you break." Simone met Patricia's gaze head-on. "You can call security if you want," she said quietly. "But I'm not moving. This is my seat." Passengers began to murmur, their curiosity growing as they watched the tense standoff unfold. "Is there a problem here?" a man in a nearby seat asked, leaning forward. Patricia turned, offering him a tight smile. "Just handling a mix-up," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. She turned back to Simone, her eyes narrowing. "Wait right here." Simone nodded, keeping her expression neutral. She wouldn't give Patricia the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. As Patricia walked toward the front of the cabin, Simone took a deep breath and looked down at her phone. She considered texting her father but hesitated. He would intervene immediately, and she wasn't sure she wanted that, yet. Moments later, Patricia returned with 2 security officers. The tension in the cabin ratcheted up another notch as the officers approached Simone's seat. "Ma'am," one of them said, his voice firm but polite, "we've been asked to escort you to another section." Simone held up her boarding pass, her voice steady. "This is my assigned seat. I have every right to be here." The officer glanced at Patricia, who nodded sharply. "Her seat is in economy," Patricia insisted, her tone leaving no room for debate. Despite the clear evidence in her hand, the officers followed Patricia's lead. Simone stood quietly, her head held high, and walked with them toward the economy section. The whispers and stares of passengers followed her down the aisle like a heavy cloak. Back in first class, Patricia returned with an air of triumph. She walked down the aisle with a smug smile, addressing her colleagues loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "That's how you handle these situations," she said. "First class is for people who belong here." Passengers exchanged glances, some chuckling softly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. In the cramped economy seat, Simone settled in and stared out the window. The sting of unfairness pulsed in her chest, but she refused to let it overwhelm her. She knew exactly who she was. Her dignity was intact. But Patricia Davis had just made a mistake she wouldn't forget. Simone sat in her cramped economy seat, her breathing steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She glanced around at the passengers nearby. Some gave her sympathetic looks. Others whispered, their gazes flitting between her and the front of the plane. A few seemed indifferent, absorbed in their worlds. Her phone buzzed in her lap. "Dad, everything okay? Text me when you're settled." Simone hesitated. She didn't want to ruin her father's day with a call for help, not yet. He always told her to stand her ground and handle situations with grace. She'd give it a little time, she thought. But her thoughts were interrupted by the sight of Patricia Davis, striding confidently down the first-class aisle, her smug expression still firmly in place. Patricia leaned in toward one of her colleagues, speaking just loud enough for those around her to hear. "You really thought you could waltz into first class and claim a seat?" Patricia said with a chuckle. "Some people just don't know their place." Her colleague, clearly uncomfortable, gave a half-hearted smile and nodded. A few first-class passengers exchanged glances, sensing something wasn't quite right. But Patricia, caught up in her own self-righteousness, didn't notice. Meanwhile, Simone sat in her seat, her fingers drumming lightly on her armrest. Every minute that passed made it harder to hold back the rising tide of frustration. She pressed the call button above her head, determined to speak with a different flight attendant and get some water. She just needed a moment to breathe and reset her focus. Several minutes passed. No one came. Simone noticed flight attendants moving up and down the aisle, tending to other passengers, but her row was conspicuously ignored. She pressed the button again. Still nothing. Finally, Patricia appeared, her polished smile nowhere to be seen. Her steps were slow and deliberate as she approached Simone's seat, stopping just a few feet away. "Yes?" Patricia said flatly, folding her arms. Simone met her gaze with quiet calm. "I requested some water," she said. "Could I get that, please?" Patricia's lips curled into a thin, condescending smile. "Of course," she said. "I'll get right on it." But she didn't. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked back to first class without another word. Simone watched her go, her pulse quickening. The deliberate disrespect was now undeniable. Simone knew she couldn't let this continue. She picked up her phone, her fingers moving with quiet urgency. "Simone." Dad, the flight attendant is targeting me. She moved me to the economy, ignored my boarding pass, and now she's refusing to serve me. It's becoming unbearable." Her father's reply came almost instantly. "Dad, stay where you are. I'm making the call now." Simone exhaled slowly, her pulse calming. She knew her father well enough to know that when he said, "I'm making the call," he wasn't bluffing. Up in the cockpit, the captain's phone rang, a secure line reserved for direct communication with airline leadership. Captain Stevens picked up, his expression calm at first, but it quickly shifted as the voice on the other end spoke. It was Charles Harris, the airline CEO. Despite his measured tone, there was no mistaking the gravity of his words. "Yes, sir," the captain said, nodding as he listened. His eyes narrowed slightly, his posture straightening. "Understood. I'll take care of it immediately." The call lasted less than a minute, but its impact was immediate. The captain hung up and tapped the intercom, his voice steady but commanding. "Miss Patricia Davis, please report to the cockpit immediately." Patricia, who had been pouring drinks in first class, froze. The light-hearted banter she had been engaging in came to an abrupt halt. Passengers looked up from their conversations, sensing the sudden energy shift. Patricia straightened her posture and made her way to the front of the plane, her confidence faltering with each step. In the cockpit, the captain waited, his expression unreadable. Patricia entered, trying to maintain her usual air of authority. "You needed me, Captain?" she said, her tone laced with forced politeness. The captain gestured toward the phone on the console. "I just received a call from Mr. Charles Harris," he said. Patricia blinked, the name hitting her like a freight train. "Charles Harris?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," the captain confirmed. "The CEO of this airline. He's been informed about an incident involving his daughter, Simone, who was unfairly removed from her seat in first class." Patricia's heart dropped into her stomach. The confident mask she had worn so proudly cracked. I didn't realize," she stammered, her usual sharpness replaced by panic. The captain cut her off, his tone firm but measured. "That's irrelevant. What matters is how you treated her. Mr. Harris will be meeting the plane personally upon landing. He expects an explanation." Patricia stood frozen, her mind racing. The weight of the situation settled on her shoulders, heavy and inescapable. She nodded slowly, her voice barely audible. "Understood." The walk back to first class was the longest of Patricia's life. Her once brisk steps were now slow and hesitant. The smug remarks that had flowed so freely earlier were gone, replaced by tense silence. Passengers noticed the change in her demeanor, whispering among themselves. For the rest of the flight, Patricia avoided eye contact with everyone, especially Simone. She knew the confrontation waiting for her upon landing wouldn't be pleasant. Simone, on the other hand, remained composed. She glanced out the window at the clouds below, a faint smile crossing her lips. The balance of power had shifted. She wasn't sure what would happen when they landed, but one thing was clear. Patricia Davis was about to face the consequences of her actions. The flight hummed along at cruising altitude, but the tension in the air was thick and unmistakable. Passengers glanced at Patricia Davis as she moved through the cabin, her usual confident demeanor replaced by an almost robotic stiffness. Her colleagues exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond to the sudden shift in her behavior. Simone sat quietly, her eyes focused on the soft glow of her phone screen. Dad's text was clear. "I'm handling it." She trusted him. He always knew how to make things right. Back in first class, Patricia couldn't shake the weight of her growing anxiety. The captain's words echoed relentlessly in her mind. "Mr. Harris will be meeting the plane personally upon landing." She replayed the events over and over, realizing how deeply she had misjudged the situation. Her steps grew slower, and her once brisk movements became hesitant. The smug satisfaction she had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Meanwhile, Simone leaned back in her seat, her calm exterior betraying the storm of thoughts beneath. She recalled her father's advice from years ago. "Never let anyone make you feel small, Simone. You have just as much right to be anywhere as anyone else. Stand tall, even when others try to push you down." The sting of Patricia's earlier actions still lingered, but Simone had learned long ago not to let moments like this define her. This wasn't the first time she'd faced prejudice, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But this time something felt different. This time she had the power to push back. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman leaned toward her husband, whispering, "Did you see the way that flight attendant treated her earlier? It was completely out of line." The man nodded solemnly. "There's no excuse for that kind of behavior," he murmured. "I wonder what's going to happen when we land." As the minutes ticked by, Simone noticed more and more passengers watching her. Their curiosity piqued. Some offered small, supportive nods. Others remained quietly observant. The plane's intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice announced, calm yet commanding, "we'll be landing shortly. Please remain seated and prepare for arrival." Simone felt a rush of anticipation. She could only imagine what her father had planned. She glanced out the window, the runway lights flickering in the distance as the plane began its descent. The aircraft touched down smoothly, its tires skimming the tarmac with practiced ease, but as the plane taxied toward the gate, passengers noticed something unusual: a sleek black SUV parked directly beside the aircraft. A murmur rippled through the cabin. "Who's that?" someone asked, craning their neck to get a better look. "That's Charles Harris," a passenger whispered. "He owns the airline." Simone watched as the door of the SUV swung open and her father stepped out. Dressed in a tailored suit, his presence was commanding and calm. Two senior airline executives flanked him, their serious expressions indicating that this was no routine visit. Inside the plane, Patricia's face went pale. Her hands tightened around the edge of a service cart as reality set in. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was far worse. Passengers watched in hushed anticipation as Charles Harris climbed the boarding stairs and entered the aircraft. His sharp eyes scanned the cabin, settling immediately on Simone. His expression softened as he approached her, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. "Are you okay?" His voice was warm, full of concern. Simone nodded, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I'm fine now, Dad." Charles rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his presence a steadying force. "It's over," he said quietly. "You won't have to deal with this again." Then his expression hardened as he stood and turned toward Patricia, who stood frozen at the front of the cabin. "Miss Davis," Charles began, his tone calm but cutting, "I understand there was an issue with my daughter's seat." Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but the words refused to come out. Finally she stammered, I didn't know she was your daughter, sir. It was a misunderstanding." Charles raised an eyebrow. The issue isn't whether or not you knew who she was. The issue is how you treated her, and how many others you've treated the same way. His words carried weight, hanging in the air like a judgment. Passengers exchanged knowing glances, silently applauding the fairness and accountability unfolding before them. Patricia's confident mask crumbled entirely. Her lips trembled and she clutched the service cart for balance. I didn't mean any harm," she whispered. Charles's gaze didn't waver. Intent doesn't matter when your actions cause harm. This airline was built on respect and dignity for every passenger. Your behavior has failed those values. A murmur of agreement spread through the cabin, followed by scattered applause. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier incident clapped enthusiastically, their approval echoing through the plane. One of the senior executives stepped forward. "Ms. Davis, please come with us," he said, his voice firm but professional. Patricia hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if searching for someone to speak up in her defense. But no one did. As she followed the executive down the aisle, her steps were slow and heavy. The whispers of passengers surrounded her, their eyes a mix of curiosity and quiet satisfaction. Simone watched her go, her expression calm and composed. There was no malice in her gaze, but there was also no forgiveness, only the quiet certainty that justice had been served. The cabin fell silent as Patricia Davis disappeared from view, escorted off the plane by the senior executive. Passengers exchanged glances, some whispering, others nodding in approval. The weight of what had just happened lingered in the air like an unspoken declaration. Justice had been served. Simone remained seated, her fingers loosely gripping the armrest as her father returned to her side. His expression was calm but resolute. "Are you sure you're okay?" Charles asked again, his voice soft but full of concern. Simone nodded, though the memory of Patricia's condescending tone still stung. "I'm fine now," she said, offering a small smile. "Thanks for stepping in, Dad." Charles smiled back, his eyes reflecting a mix of pride and relief. "Always. No one messes with my daughter." His words carried a weight that seemed to settle over the entire cabin. For a moment the tension eased, and passengers began to relax, turning their attention back to their bags and belongings as the plane prepared for disembarkation. But just as the cabin crew prepared to open the doors, a flight attendant hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Charles. "Excuse me, Mr. Harris," she said nervously. "I just want to say that was the right thing to do. We've all seen things happen like that before, but it usually goes unchecked." Charles's expression hardened slightly. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "It's important that it never happens again, not to my daughter, not to anyone." The flight attendant nodded, clearly relieved to have spoken up, and quickly returned to her duties. Meanwhile, Simone stood to gather her things. She felt the subtle glances from other passengers, the quiet hum of conversation as people discussed what had just unfolded. Near the front of the plane, an older woman caught Simone's eye. Her kind smile carried a silent message. "You did well." "Excuse me," the woman said, stepping closer. "I just wanted to say how gracefully you handled yourself. That couldn't have been easy." Simone's chest tightened with emotion, but she managed a polite nod. "Thank you," she replied. "It means a lot to hear that." Charles placed a hand on Simone's shoulder, guiding her toward the exit. The captain, who had remained composed throughout the ordeal, offered a respectful nod. "Mr. Harris, Ms. Harris, safe travels," he said. Simone paused at the door, taking one last glance at the cabin. For a fleeting moment she felt the full weight of what had just happened, the humiliation, the unfairness, the vindication, and the quiet power she now held. She stepped onto the jet bridge with her father at her side, her heart a little lighter. But this story wasn't over yet. In the terminal, a small crowd of airport staff had gathered near the gate. News travels fast in the airline industry, and it was clear that word of the incident had spread. Charles acknowledged them with a nod but kept moving, determined to protect his daughter from further scrutiny. Outside, the sleek black SUV waited for them. The driver opened the door, and Charles gestured for Simone to enter first. As the vehicle pulled away, the hum of the airport faded behind them, replaced by the quiet purr of the engine and the steady rhythm of the road beneath them. Simone leaned her head against the window, her thoughts swirling. She had faced moments like this before, moments when people assumed she didn't belong, when their prejudices became impossible to ignore. But this time, something had shifted. This time, she wasn't alone. Charles broke the silence. "I'm proud of you, you know," he said, his voice low and steady. "You handled yourself with dignity, even when you were being treated unfairly. Not everyone could have done that." Simone smiled softly. "I learn from the best," she said. They drove on in silence for a few more minutes before Charles spoke again. "This isn't just about today, Simone," he said. "This is about the bigger picture. What happened on that plane? It's not the first time something like this has happened, and it won't be the last. But we can't let it slide. If we don't stand up, nothing will change." Simone nodded. "I know," she said, "and I'm ready to stand up." Back at the airline's headquarters, Charles wasted no time. He called an emergency meeting with his senior leadership team, determined to address what had happened. "This isn't just a one-off incident," Charles began, his voice firm. "This is a symptom of a larger problem, and we need to confront it head-on." He outlined a plan to implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all airline staff, from flight attendants to executives. He insisted that the training be thorough and ongoing, not just a one-time event. "We're not just fixing a PR issue," Charles said. "We're setting a new standard for how we treat our passengers and each other." His words resonated with the team. They had seen how Charles operated over the years, with integrity, fairness, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. And now that commitment was about to change the airline for the better. Simone, meanwhile, found herself at the center of a growing conversation. News of the incident had spread far beyond the airline, making headlines and sparking discussions about prejudice, privilege, and fairness in customer service. Friends, family, and even strangers reached out to offer their support. "I saw what happened on the plane," one message read. "Thank you for standing up for yourself and for all of us who faced something similar." Each message was a reminder that her experience wasn't just hers alone. It was part of a much larger story, one that was still unfolding. A few days later, the airline headquarters buzzed with activity. Employees gathered in the main conference room, whispering quietly among themselves. This meeting felt different, urgent, serious. Everyone had heard about the incident on the plane, and many wondered how the company would respond. At the front of the room stood Charles Harris, his presence commanding and calm. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the sea of familiar faces, flight attendants, gate agents, customer service staff, and executives. "Thank you all for being here," Charles began, his voice steady but firm. "I won't sugarcoat this. What happened on Flight 3447 was unacceptable. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a clear failure of our values. A young girl was humiliated, judged unfairly, and treated as if she didn't belong. And that young girl just happens to be my daughter." The room fell silent. People exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone knew exactly what he was talking about, but hearing it put so plainly sent a ripple of tension through the crowd. Charles continued, "But this isn't just about Simone. It's about something bigger, something we've all seen but maybe haven't confronted head-on. This company was built on respect and fairness, yet somewhere along the way, some of us forgot what that means." He paused, letting the words sink in. "That changes today." The murmurs started again, this time tinged with curiosity and hope. Charles nodded toward the back of the room. A projector flickered to life, displaying the words diversity, inclusion, and respect training, a new standard for our airline. "We're rolling out mandatory training across the company," Charles explained. "Not just once, but on an ongoing basis. This will be about more than policies. It'll be about changing the way we think and act, holding ourselves accountable, and treating every single person who boards our planes with the dignity and respect they deserve." The employees sat quietly, processing his words. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked thoughtful, their expressions suggesting they were beginning to realize how deeply this issue ran. One hand shot up from the back of the room. It was a veteran flight attendant named Marcy, her brow furrowed. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice clear, "I've been with this airline for 15 years and I've seen things like this happen before. I didn't always speak up, but I should have. If we're serious about this, I'm ready to do my part." Charles smiled, his eyes warm. "Thank you, Marcy. That's exactly the attitude we need, honesty and a willingness to do better." The room began to hum with quiet agreement. One by one, more hands went up, flight attendants and ground crew members volunteering to help with the new program. The atmosphere had shifted. What had started as a somber meeting now carried a spark of change, a real desire to improve. Simone, meanwhile, sat in her room at home, scrolling through her phone. Messages from friends and acquaintances kept pouring in, but one particular comment caught her eye. "Thank you for being brave enough to stand up for yourself. You've given me the courage to speak up too." The words struck a chord deep in her chest. Her experience on that plane, though painful, had sparked something bigger than herself. People were sharing their own stories of discrimination and unfair treatment, using her experience as a catalyst for change. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from her father. "Training program launched today. First session went great. Proud of you." Simone smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. She could almost hear his voice, calm and reassuring, just like always. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard before she typed back, "Proud of you too, Dad. We're making a difference." At the airline, the changes began immediately. The diversity training sessions were unlike anything the employees had experienced before, raw, emotional, and deeply personal. Role-playing exercises forced them to confront their biases head-on, while guest speakers shared real-world experiences of discrimination and how it had affected their lives. Employees left the sessions with new perspectives, many visibly moved. Some admitted that they hadn't even realized how ingrained their biases were until they were forced to confront them. Others expressed regret for moments when they had stayed silent instead of speaking up. Charles made it a point to attend every session, observing quietly from the back of the room. He wanted to be present, to listen, to learn, and to make sure the change was real. Meanwhile, news of the airline's new initiative spread beyond the company. Major media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a powerful example of accountability and change. "Airline CEO takes a stand against discrimination," read one headline. "From prejudice to progress, how one incident sparked a movement," said another. Social media buzzed with conversations about fairness and respect in customer service. Hashtags like Inclusion Matters and Stand Up for Justice began trending. Simone watched it all unfold with a mix of pride and awe. She had never expected her experience to spark such a widespread conversation, but she was grateful that it had. One night, while scrolling through the comments on a news article, she saw a familiar name: Patricia Davis. The former flight attendant had written a long post, apologizing for her actions and reflecting on the lessons she had learned. "I can't undo what I did," Patricia wrote, "but I'm committed to learning and doing better. This experience has opened my eyes in ways I never expected. I've been humbled, and I'm ready to grow." Simone stared at the screen, her emotions swirling. She wasn't sure how to feel. Part of her wanted to believe Patricia's words, but another part of her was wary. Still, she knew that growth was possible, and that even the hardest lessons could lead to change. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Respect is a value no one can take from you. But it's also something we have to give, even when it's hard." Simone exhaled slowly. She wasn't ready to forgive just yet, but she was willing to watch and see if Patricia truly meant what she said. As the training programs continued to transform the airline's culture, something remarkable began to happen. Conversations that once seemed uncomfortable became opportunities for connection and growth. Employees started sharing their experiences openly, reflecting on moments they were proud of and those they regretted. Simone's story became a touchstone for the company, a reminder of how deeply words and actions could affect someone's sense of belonging. At first, her father had wanted to protect her from the public spotlight. But Simone, with her quiet strength and newfound confidence, insisted on using her voice to inspire change. One afternoon, Charles sat at the head of a large conference table, flanked by several department heads. Simone stood next to him, her hands folded in front of her. The room was filled with employees, reporters, and even a few passengers who had come to share their perspectives. Charles smiled at his daughter, his pride unmistakable. "Today," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "Simone has agreed to share her story with all of you, not because she wants sympathy, but because we believe her experience can teach us something important." The room grew quiet as Simone stepped forward. For a brief moment, she felt the weight of all the eyes on her. But then she thought of her father and the countless messages she had received from people who had faced similar situations. "I was nervous about speaking today," Simone began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But I realized that staying silent only helps these kinds of things continue. What happened to me on that flight hurt. It made me feel small and invisible, as if I didn't belong. No one should ever feel that way." A few heads nodded in agreement. Some employees looked down at their hands, clearly reflecting on their own moments of judgment. "But what really struck me," Simone continued, "was that no one spoke up. I kept thinking, what if just one person had stepped forward to say, 'Hey, this isn't right'? Maybe things would have turned out differently." The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. "Well, that's what I'm asking all of you to do," she said, her eyes sweeping across the room. "Speak up. If you see something wrong, don't stay silent. Be the person who makes a difference." For a moment there was only silence. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the room. It grew louder and stronger, filling the space with a sense of unity and shared purpose. Charles placed a hand on Simone's shoulder. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. As the applause died down, Charles turned back to the group. "We've made a lot of progress, but this is just the beginning. Every day we have the chance to choose respect, fairness, and kindness. Let's not waste that opportunity. The story didn't end there. The airline continued to roll out new initiatives aimed at fostering a more inclusive culture. Passengers noticed the difference almost immediately. Flight attendants were warmer, more attentive, and less quick to judge. Complaints about biased treatment dropped significantly, replaced by glowing reviews of exceptional service. One day, Simone boarded another flight, this time with a quiet sense of confidence she hadn't felt in a long time. She smiled at the flight attendant, who greeted her with genuine warmth. As she settled into her first-class seat, Simone glanced around the cabin. Everything felt different, lighter. A woman seated next to her leaned over. "You must fly a lot," she said with a friendly smile. Simone returned the smile. "I guess you could say that," she replied. The flight took off smoothly, and Simone felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. She knew that change wasn't always easy, but it was always worth fighting for. At the airline's annual employee recognition event, Charles took the stage once again, this time with an air of celebration. "It's been a year since we began this journey," he said, his voice filled with pride. "And I want to thank each and every one of you for your commitment to making our airline a place where everyone feels welcome." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But there's one person who deserves special recognition today. Someone whose courage and grace sparked all of this. My daughter, Simone." The crowd erupted into applause as Simone joined her father on stage. She felt her cheeks flush, but her heart swelled with gratitude. Charles handed her a small plaque. "For inspiring us all," he said. Simone smiled, holding the plaque close. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us, choosing to be better, kinder, and braver every single day." Back at home that evening, Simone and Charles sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You've changed things," Charles said, his voice warm. Simone leaned against his shoulder. "We changed things," she corrected. For a long moment they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past year lifting like a gentle breeze. "You know," Charles said, a mischievous glint in his eye, "I think we need to take another trip soon." Simone chuckled. "First class, of course." Charles laughed, wrapping an arm around her. "First class, always." The day after the recognition event, news of the airline's transformation spread far beyond its employees. Social media buzzed with praise for the airline's new policies, inspiring many others to share their own experiences of discrimination and moments of triumph. Hashtags like "Inclusion Matters" and "Stand Up for Justice" began trending, sparking widespread conversations about fairness and accountability in public spaces. Simone watched the growing response with awe. It felt surreal seeing how her experience had grown into something so much bigger, how it had given others a platform to speak out and demand change. Messages poured into her inbox, many from people who had faced similar situations but hadn't known how to confront them. One message, in particular, caught her attention. It was from a woman named Kendra, who shared a harrowing experience of being denied entry to a luxury hotel because of her appearance. The woman's story ended with a line that sent chills down Simone's spine. "I didn't have a voice back then, but watching you stand tall has given me the courage to take mine back." Simone closed her laptop, overwhelmed with emotion. She never intended to become a symbol of change, but it was clear that her voice had become something powerful, something that could no longer be silenced. Weeks later, Simone and Charles were invited to a national conference on diversity and inclusion in corporate America. Held in a grand hall filled with executives, policymakers, and advocates, the conference aimed to showcase real-world examples of how companies could promote fairness and respect. As Simone took the stage, the lights dimmed and the crowd grew quiet. Her heart beat faster than it ever had before, but she drew strength from the memory of everything she had overcome. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady despite the rush of nerves. "My name is Simone, and I am here today because I believe every experience, no matter how painful, can become a catalyst for change." The room listened intently as Simone recounted the story of that fateful flight, weaving her personal pain with the broader message of perseverance and accountability. She spoke about how moments of humiliation had nearly crushed her confidence, and how people's silence had been just as painful as the discrimination itself. "But I also learned," she continued, "that silence is a choice. We can choose to speak up, to demand better, and to refuse to be complicit in unfair systems. Change doesn't come from staying quiet. It comes from courage, from standing up even when it's uncomfortable." The applause that followed was thunderous, filling the hall with a sense of shared purpose. Later that evening, Simone and Charles sat on a bench outside the conference center, the cool breeze ruffling their hair. Simone tilted her head back, gazing at the stars, and exhaled a long breath. "You know," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I never imagined any of this would happen. I just wanted to get on a plane and go home." Charles chuckled softly. "Life has a funny way of surprising us," he said. "But you were ready for it, even if you didn't know it at the time." Simone nodded slowly. "I guess so." "More than ready," Charles added, squeezing her hand gently. "You've inspired people, Simone. You've shown them that their voices matter. You've reminded me of that too." A wave of gratitude washed over her. For all the hurt and frustration she had endured, there had also been an incredible amount of growth, connection, and healing. And through it all, her father had been her unwavering support, a constant reminder of the strength they both carried. "Thank you, Dad," she said softly, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. He smiled, his voice full of warmth. "Always, Simone, always." In the months that followed, the airline became a shining example of what corporate responsibility could look like. Simone continued to work closely with her father and the leadership team, helping shape policies that would ensure no one else had to endure what she had. Passengers began to notice the difference almost immediately. Customer service ratings soared, and glowing reviews filled online forums. People spoke of flight attendants who treated everyone with kindness and respect, regardless of their appearance or background. The culture had shifted dramatically, and the airline was quickly gaining a reputation as a leader in fairness and inclusion. Even Claudia, the former flight attendant who had once humiliated Simone, found herself on a path of redemption. After being given a second chance, she embraced the opportunity to learn and grow. She became one of the most vocal advocates for change, often volunteering to speak at staff training sessions about the lessons she had learned. Simone ran into Claudia at one such session. They exchanged polite smiles, and Claudia hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Simone," Claudia said quietly, her voice laced with sincerity, "I owe you an apology. A real one. Not just for that day on the plane, but for everything. I was wrong. You didn't deserve any of that." Simone studied her for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong." "I appreciate it." Claudia nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face. "I've changed," she said. thanks to you and everything that's happened. I just wanted you to know that." Simone smiled softly. "We're all capable of change," she said. "The important thing is that we keep moving forward." On her next flight, Simone found herself seated next to a young girl traveling alone for the first time. The girl clutched her boarding pass nervously, her eyes wide with anticipation. Simone leaned over, offering a reassuring smile. "First flight?" The girl nodded. "Yeah, I'm a little scared." Simone's heart softened. "You'll be just fine," she said warmly. "And if you need anything, just ask. I'll be right here." As the plane taxied down the runway and took to the sky, Simone glanced out the window, watching the world shrink beneath them. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace, a quiet certainty that she had found her purpose, not just in her own journey, but in helping others navigate theirs. It wasn't the path she had expected, but it was one she was deeply grateful for. As the flight attendant walked down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks with a genuine smile, Simone caught her eye and nodded in thanks. The past felt far away now, a distant memory that had helped shape her into who she was today. Looking at the young girl beside her, Simone whispered, "We all have a voice. Never be afraid to use it." And with that, she leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes as the plane soared higher and higher, carrying her toward new possibilities. If you believe in fairness, courage, and speaking out against injustice, hit that like button and subscribe to Black Inspiring Stories for more powerful tales just like this one. Together, we can make a difference, one story at a time.